Hi, my name is Colin Bancroft, and today I'm going to be giving a brief lecture on the leadership of Mikhail Gorbachev. Now, as a historical figure, Gorbachev is a really interesting topic because of some of the inherent contradictions in terms of his effectiveness. In particular, how he failed at his goal to maintain the Soviet Union, but he was a successful moral leader in the eyes of the world and helped bring about the end to one of the more brutal conflicts of the modern era, which would be the Cold War. A little background on Mikhail Gorbachev and his history. So Mikhail Gorbachev really is a success story of someone who rose from nothing to be one of the most powerful people in the world. He was born in a small village in the USSR in 1931, and one of his first jobs was actually acting as the assistant to a combine operator during World War II. He was well regarded in that role. He won an award from the communist government, and then he went to law school in 1950, graduating in 1955, where he took up a series of regional leadership positions within the USSR. After holding those positions and rising through the ranks within his region, he finally got into the Central Committee in the early 1970s, and by 1985 he was the General Secretary of the USSR, which is essentially the leader of the entire USSR and the Eastern Bloc in the Cold War. Now, Gorbachev really was through and through a reformer of the system. He loved the communist system, he wanted to preserve it, but he understood that by this time in the 1980s, the system was starting to crumble. And one of the first acts that he did, and one of his first initiatives, was the glasnost policy. And what this policy was it was a reform of the censorship and freedom of speech mechanisms that were in place in the Soviet Union. The Soviet Union was a very restrictive society. Criticism of politicians was criminalized. Everything in the media was censored and state-run. What Gorbachev did was start to loosen the controls around this system to allow some freedom of speech, to allow some criticism of politicians. The reason he did this is because he hoped that by involving the citizens of the USSR in the political process, he could try and root out some of the corruption and inefficiency and bureaucracy that was so inherent in this system. He hoped that they would call out politicians and force the politicians to change their ways, and that overall the society would become more productive. Now, if we take a look at this strategy in terms of a leadership perspective, what we see here is really a participative leadership and an empowerment approach. Specifically, he's getting the people involved in the political process. He's eliciting their feedback so that the politicians can make better decisions. Unfortunately, while the intention was to make the system better through this action, instead what he did was accelerate its demise. What happened was, once the freedom of press started to become available, it highlighted a lot of the inefficiencies of the system and just stirred up unrest within the USSR and within the entire Eastern Bloc. And this unrest just accelerated the disintegration and added fuel to already the budding democratic movements. We can see the roots of this failure within the theory itself. Empowerment and participative leadership models are most effective in organizations that are decentralized, that have a lot of exposure to external stakeholders, and have a lot of trust between the follower and the leader. The USSR was none of these things. It was a highly centralized society that had no contact with external stakeholders, both due to physical barriers like the Berlin Wall and informational barriers. And there was no trust between the followers and the leaders themselves. It was a highly surveilled society. So these policies were not well fit to the followers that Gorbachev was trying to lead and deal with. The second major policy shift that Gorbachev implemented had to do with foreign policy and military policy. And a little background on what the prior state of foreign policy was for the Soviet Union. So the Soviet Union had always operated under what was called the Brezhnev Doctrine. What this was it was a promise of Soviet military intervention in allied communist countries that were undergoing revolutions. And this actually happened several times over the course of the Cold War in Czechoslovakia, in East Berlin, to a certain extent in Poland. The Soviet military sent its soldiers or advisors into these countries to help put down protests and revolutions. However, by the late 80s, this entire policy was starting to become ineffective for a lot of reasons, one of which was a long and costly war in Afghanistan that drained the Soviet military. But there was also a lot of foreign policy pressure on the Soviet government to not crack down on civilians anymore. He renounced this policy in 1989, and within 2 years, just about all of the Warsaw Pact allied nations had undergone peaceful revolutions in most cases to overthrow their communist governments. So the renunciation of the policy really was a failure. In terms of leadership theory, this failure can really be seen in the way that it was done from a situational leadership perspective. So Gorbachev renounced the policy because of pressure due to changing situations and the place that the USSR was in terms of foreign policy. But what he really did was he shifted from a directive approach, which was the Brezhnev Doctrine, where Soviet soldiers would go in and directly interfere with the sovereignty of other nations, to a delegation style where the leaders of these nations, Gorbachev's followers, were completely on their own to ensure stability within their own countries. Now, the thing about the situational leadership model is it's supposed to be a vacillation from one style to another, going from directing to coaching to supporting to delegating, depending on the competencies and readiness of the follower themselves. By jumping directly from the directive style to the delegating style, Gorbachev skipped the coaching and supporting and ended up leaving his followers alone without any support and in a much more rapid transition than they were prepared for. And this can really be seen in how rapidly all of their governments fell. The final incident I want to talk about is the August coup. This is towards the very end of Gorbachev's reign in the USSR. So the USSR was made up of 15 different states all combined into one country. But by 1991, there was a lot of internal pressure between the hardliners who wanted to restore the USSR to its glory and these new independence movements in different states within the country itself. By August of 1991, the hardliners decided that Gorbachev needed to go. They went to his house and placed him on house arrest. The country was in chaos for a period of about 4 days until all the conspirators were arrested. By the time this was over, Gorbachev's political power was spent. What's interesting about this historical episode is that a lot of analysis has found that Gorbachev had every opportunity to step up as a leader during this coup. For starters, Gorbachev had 32 armed guards at his compound with him. He outnumbered the conspirators' forces at the time. He could have easily had the conspirators arrested then and there. He also had access to communication with the outside world, and he also had access to transportation. For whatever reason, Gorbachev chose not to utilize any of these things, not to interfere with the coup. Taking it back to the leadership methods, this really is representative of non-leadership. A laissez-faire or a impoverished leadership approach. He essentially chose to let it ride in terms of a laissez-faire approach, to let the conspirators do what they wanted and see what happened. And he showed very little concern for either his task, which was to preserve the Soviet Union, or his people, the people following him, which really shows an impoverished approach. Predictably, this really ended his political career, and it ended communism as a force in Eastern Europe. Within 4 months, every single state had declared independence from the USSR, including Russia, and Gorbachev was finished as a political leader. He resigned. Now, what's interesting is the contrast of Gorbachev, the leader, trying to accomplish his goal of preserving the USSR, and Gorbachev, the moral leader. Gorbachev's policies, while they failed to preserve the Soviet state, probably ended up saving a lot of lives. He could have militarily intervened in all these countries that were having revolutions, but he chose not to. And what happened was all these countries had peaceful revolutions without much bloodshed. Also, his policies, like the Glasnost policy, introduced new freedoms to people in a society that never had it before. So as a moral leader, Gorbachev really has a lot to stand on, and as a matter of fact, in 1990 he was awarded the Nobel Peace Prize for his efforts. In the ultimate analysis, I think the best thing to say about Gorbachev is that he was a successful failure. He failed to preserve the Soviet Union with his reforms, but he also did a lot of good for a lot of people by failing. His policies helped introduce more democracy, more freedom of speech, bring about the resolution of a long Cold War that could have led to nuclear devastation. As a leader, he failed at his goal, but I think we have a lot to thank him for in the way that he failed, because I think the world ended up better for it. These are my references. Thank you for your time.